Welcome back to UC University Old Testament Overview. This is part 3 of Numbers. Past promises will prevail in spite of present problems. You can catch the first 2 by looking on our website at Union Church Rio. Next, we turn to God's punishment preserves His promises, chapters 11 through 16. Complain is the word that appears in nearly every one of the next 6 chapters. In spite of reason for great optimism, God's people are grumbling. In chapter 11:1, they complain about their hardships. In chapter 11:13, they complain about their food. In chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' own brother and sister, talk against them. Finally, in chapter 13, we come to the worst transgression. For it is here that God's people show that they do not trust that God will give them the land. In this famous chapter, Yahweh has instructed Moses to send spies into the land. 12 spies went in. On their return, here was their report. Numbers 13, 27, and 28. We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are very strong, and their cities are fortified and are very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. That wasn't exactly the reporting that Moses was hoping they'd bring back. Caleb's report in verse 30 is more like it. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Those are the words of faith and trust in God's promises. But of the 12 spies, only Caleb and Joshua responded in faith. The 10 other spies complained that victory was impossible. And sadly, it wasn't only the spies who lacked faith. Listen to the response of the people in chapter 14. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people went that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we would have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land, to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Okay, so it's mutiny, and worse, they want to return to slavery. As Moses and Aaron are quick to point out, their rebellion is against the Lord. They don't want to be separate people. They don't want a separate land. They don't want to bless the nations. They don't want God's presence. Now it's worth pausing here to reflect on the roots of their sin and often our own sin. Notice the constant connection between their dissatisfaction and their sin. Complaining reveals an underlying spiritual state. The people are given supernatural food they don't have to work for. They've been miraculously rescued from Egypt without having to fight a single battle. They have a faithful leader. They have God's law. It's easy to see how they've been blessed and how inappropriate their complaining is. But how often do we have the similar attitude? Sinful dissatisfaction tells us more about our souls than our circumstances. Beware of discontentment. So back to Numbers. What are the results of all this discontentment? Well, it's complaints at hardships, God sends fire to burn the camp. When it's complaints at food, God sends a plague. When it's Miriam's complaining, God sends leprosy. But when it's a total lack of trust in all of God's promises, well, Yahweh is having none of it. His wrath is kindled. Look at how He protects Moses and pronounces the sentence against the people in chapter 14, verses 10 through 12. Listen for God's anger when they lack faith. Then all the congregation said to the stone them, that is, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, with stones. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. And I will make of you a nation greater or mightier than they." And so just like with the golden calf in Exodus, Yahweh is ready to blot them out. A long way from the first 10 chapters, don't you think? What a tragedy. And it's because of their lack of faith in God's promises. But it is here that we have another opportunity to see the ministry of our Lord Jesus Christ, as Moses again prefigures and foreshadows Christ by what he does next, as Moses pleads for the people in verses 13 through 19, basing his appeal on God's desire for his own glory and fame. And as a result, God forgives him in verse 20 and doesn't destroy them. But the people's unbelief is serious, and as a result, there are real punishment for God's people. Look at the next few verses in verses 21 through 23. "But truly as I live, and all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give them to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it. Okay, so what's the connection is there between this punishment and God's promises? On the surface, it seems as though God's punishment is breaking his promises. But we need to remember that God, back in Exodus, declared to these very people that they would only be blessed if they kept his covenant and obeyed. If they didn't, they would be cursed. So God is in fact keeping his promise. God had promised to punish their lack of faith. But what about the Abrahamic promises? Where are they in relation to these? Well, in relation to the promise of God's people, it seems that God's people are no more. Not one of them shall see the land I promised to their forefathers. Verse 23 said, nevertheless, if we jump down to verse 31 of chapter 14, we can still see that God is going to achieve his promises to his people. Verse 31 says, but your little ones, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know that the land you have rejected. What irony! And with this, there is still hope. With this in mind, the promised place is still just about in sight, but the land would not be inherited by the faithless. In fact, in verse 25 of chapter 14, we get perhaps the most depressing verse in the whole of Numbers. Turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. In other words, go back to where you came from. So the promise of a place would have to wait until another generation because of their lack of faith. Hebrews 3 applies this tragedy directly to us. I'll read it to you. Hebrews 3:16 through 19. For who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned and whose body fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But to those who were disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Hebrews tells us to take the experience of Israel as a very stern warning to us. Just like them, we've heard the gospel, but we've heard it much more clearly. You can be exposed to much grace, much biblical teaching, and still miss God's place. And of course, missing God's place may have cost the Israelites the promised land, but it would cost us heaven. You must have faith, and you must persevere in faith until the end. Don't let sin and unbelief deceive you and lead you to make a shipwreck of your faith. Don't play with fire. You're not in heaven yet. Persevere in faith. So that's all about place. But thirdly, it's worth noting that God's presence is still with them. God hasn't left them. He continues to speak to Moses in chapter 15 and chapter 16. In spite of continued grumbling, God reveals himself in glory to them in a cloud. In this section, we see little interaction with other people, although it is noteworthy that because of the Israelites' sin, their ability to be a blessing to the nations is quite diminished. We're going to pause right here and pick up where we left off next time. Thanks for joining us for UC University. Stay safe. See you later. See you soon.